Good morning and welcome to another edition of The Legal Zone, where we tackle injustice. Today we have another amazing show with another amazing guest. But first, let me welcome the lovely Dr. Cheney. Dr. Cheney, good morning. How are you?
Good morning.
Mr. John Salati, how are you doing this morning?
Great, Salon. Great to be here. Hope you are well as well.
I'm doing great. All righty, I'm going to share my screen. And I found that having these things pre-typed works better. So we're going to be talking about landlord and tenant issues today. And it's almost February. Last week in February, the last Thursday in February, we have tons of people all across the nation who would be taking the bar exam. You would more than likely see this on the exam. Landlord and tenants. Whenever a landlord and a tenant enters into a lease, right off the top, the landlord promises that neither he nor anyone else would interfere with the tenant's lawful possession. That may not be spelled out like that in the lease, but it's implied. That's called the covenant of quiet enjoyment. The landlord promises that he will not interfere or send someone to interfere with the lawful possession. In addition to that implied covenant is what's called the implied warrant of habitability. That is, the rental unit will be maintained in a physical condition that provides safe, decent, and habitable housing for the tenants. It's implied, it's there. If you're renting, the landlord has to make sure that your dwelling place is habitable. Now, what does that mean? There's basic essentials that every unit, every home, every apartment must have. Heat. Even in Florida, can you imagine? Florida is the hottest state, and the landlord has to provide heat, but not AC. Go figure. Hot water, plumbing, safe kitchen appliances, and this varies from state to state, but all have to have safe and sound structural conditions. That's a must. These things landlords must provide. Now, eviction. We've all heard of eviction. Some of you listening may have been evicted. Some of you listening may be facing eviction. Hope not. What is an eviction? An eviction is the dispossession of a tenant of a leased property. Basic. The landlord causes the tenant to no longer live in the home. It could be an illegal eviction. It could be a legal eviction. But overall, the eviction is the disposition of a tenant in a leased property. There are two types of evictions. There's actual and there's constructive. Remember that. Two types of evictions. Actual eviction occurs when the landlord locks the tenant out of the house, apartment, the unit. He physically goes and changes the locks. Or nowadays, he may change the code because, you know, we're fancy and we have these codes, and he might change it and you can't get in. Constructive eviction occurs when the landlord intentionally, remember that word, fails or interferes with the tenant's intended enjoyment of the property. The tenant must leave because the home is no longer enjoyable or habitable. One of these things are no longer working, and so they have to leave. When that happens, the tenant has two options. One, stay and sue for the damages, or two, vacate. Therein you have the constructive eviction, and then sue for the damage thereafter. This is what we're going to be talking about today in our show. We have with us an attorney named William, or Will, he goes by Will, Merrifield. Merrifield, I'm sorry.
That's all right.
I'm a boxing fan, and every time I hear...
It's a common mistake. You have no idea how many people do it. Yeah.
Yes. So Will Merrifield
You got it.
is an attorney at the Washington Legal Clinic for the Homeless, where he represents tenants associations fighting displacement against large-scale redevelopment projects. Will has been involved in some of the preeminent housing struggles in the DC area. During this past decade, as the attorney for both the Congress Heights and Brooklyn Manor Tenant Association. We are honored this morning to have Mr. Merriweather. Will, how you doing this morning?
Good, good. How are you doing? Thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
Thank you for coming on. Now, you fought for tenants facing some of the things that we just defined, right?
Yeah, absolutely. The concepts of, I started out my legal career actually in Ohio, and I would defend people against just common evictions. So, I had a bunch of individual clients. I had an office in the courthouse, and I was in court pretty much all day, every day, defending people against evictions. A lot of it was people being evicted from public housing units for, various things. So that was the first 6 years of my legal career. And then I came.
So illegal evictions is something that's popular.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, evictions, especially in Ohio at that time, it was right after the financial crisis in 2008. So, the international economy had basically crashed. A lot of people were being dispossessed from their homes. A lot of landlords were doing self-help evictions at that time, trying to get people out of their homes. So
what's a self-help eviction? What's that?
it's just what you had spoke about earlier. It's another term for constructive eviction. So it'd be somebody changing the locks or somebody making a unit so uninhabitable, so awful that people on their own volition just leave. A lot of people don't know their rights. So, they'll just leave if a property, is too terrible to stay in. So that was the first half of my legal career, was representing individuals in those cases. I then came to Washington, D.C. because I was interested in doing more broad work with whole tenant associations. And I'm sure that a lot of people, especially the people in DC that are watching this know, the amount of dispossession, the amount of displacement that's happened in DC over the last decade and before, with, the flood of development money coming into Washington, DC, and having whole communities that have been traditionally underinvested in, now having a flood of developer capital coming into those communities and pushing out people who had lived there. And the pushing out of people that have lived there often coincides with really underhanded tactics to get people out of their homes in those existing communities. Because these developers, they need to knock down what's there to build new. And to knock down what's there, you need people out of their homes. So that is the work that I've done, is representing tenants who are under a lot of times severe duress because there's a developer coming after the land that they live on, and they want to knock down their homes and build something new there that's not for the people that live there now.
Wow. So, and this is what was going on in Congress Heights. Tell us about what happened with Congress Heights.
Yeah, sure. Congress Heights was a parcel of land. So Congress Heights is a neighborhood in DC. And I represented a tenant coalition there called the 13th Street Alabama Avenue Tenant Coalition. And they lived in a group of buildings right over the Congress Heights Metro. And, I am very untechnologically savvy, so I should have shared this, but I wasn't able to. But let me see if I can if you can see these buildings in this neighborhood, there's a metro right here. And the coalition lived in 1331 and 1333, that building, 1309 and 3210. And then this building, 3200, was vacant. Okay. There was a developer who started buying up these properties in 2009 and 2010. And he wanted to demolish all these buildings, 1333, 1331, 1309, 3200, 3210. He wanted to demolish them all. He's going to build luxury apartments and an office building above the metro. What was also really, interesting and relevant to those properties is that right across the street from that metro is a big parcel of land called St. Elizabeth's East. And the government had been pouring hundreds of millions of dollars into St. Elizabeth's East to use that as an opportunity to spur development in the community as a whole, a community that, you know, people want development in their community. So this was where, you know, I came into this project. There was a plan put forth to demolish those buildings. The tenants had no idea about that plan. The developer never knocked on their door, never told them about the plan, never offered any options to them concerning.
Was he obligated to?
I mean, you're obligated to at some point, because at some point you have to give notice that you're going to demolish buildings. General, you know, human instinct would be to try to get out. If the developer wanted to knock these down, he should have known he was going to have to come to some sort of an agreement with the tenants. This developer didn't take that path. He put forward his plan in the general community, and the tenants found out about it in the general community before they heard anything from the developer. And that's when they called a housing organizer, who called me to just discuss with them what their options were.
Now, you mentioned something about St. Elizabeth's. What exactly is that?
St. Elizabeth's is a big parcel of land. It was largely an empty parcel of land. Right now, there's a lot of development going on at St. Elizabeth's. They built a new basketball arena at St. Elizabeth's for the women's WNBA team. And there's just, you know, a lot of housing going up across the street at St. Elizabeth's. So St. Elizabeth's was a big, mostly empty parcel of land that, you know, the DC government wanted to subsidize the development of. And they did that through giving away land to developers and subsidizing those developers to build mostly market rate housing there.
Wow. Okay.
So this developer, the person who owned these buildings, his name was Sanford Capital. That was the name of the company. Now they started buying up
Capital.
Sanford Capital. They're now notorious as maybe the biggest slumlords in DC. Then nobody really knew who they were. But they had started buying up these properties in 2009 and 2010. And when you talk to the tenants, when they started buying these properties are in pretty decent shape. But Sanford had a specific business model. So they had access to capital. They had a bunch of investors that would give them money to buy up properties in traditionally underinvested neighborhoods, usually east of the river in Washington, DC. So these are neighborhoods in DC that haven't seen the economic development that a lot of other neighborhoods have in Washington, DC. They would sit on those properties. So they would, you know, speculate on the land of those properties. They would not make repairs to the properties because their business model always involved what they would call repositioning the properties at some point. When the time came right, they wanted to redevelop the properties in these neighborhoods. And the time was perfect at this Congress Heights location. Because if I just described, they had all this redevelopment going on right across the street, and they own the land right above the metro. So politically, they were aware enough to buy up these parcels of land and sit on them. So they were warehousing tenants in these buildings. And like I said, when they first bought the buildings, they were in decent shape. Talking to the tenants, as soon as they bought the buildings started to go downhill because there was no money placed into the buildings, you know, once they bought them. To Sanford Capital, I believe, I'm speculating here, I can't get in the mind of Sanford Capital, but they were a couple guys, lived in Bethesda. I don't even think they thought about the people living in their buildings. I think they saw the buildings just as assets in their portfolio, and they could care less about who was living in them. That was just income generating for them while they waited to put forward a redevelopment plan to really cash in on the properties.
And when they purchased them, were they, because you said they were just sitting there, so I imagine they weren't doing anything to fix it up, take care of
No, like I said, if you talk to the tenants, the people that own the properties before Sanford, they were pretty good landlords, you know, like these garden style apartments. When you talk to people that live in garden style apartments in DC, the things will last forever if you keep them upright, because they're really well built. I mean, they're brick. You know, they're if you make necessary repairs to these, you know, garden style units, they can be really nice because they're big. You know, they have a lot of room for people, and they can really be like great places to rent if you got a good landlord. So they had a good landlord. That landlord sold to Sanford, and Sanford just stopped making repairs almost immediately to these buildings.
Wow. Intentionally.
Intentionally. I don't even know. Yes, like, you know, they weren't even, I don't even believe that, like I said, I don't even think they were thinking about the people living there. They were just waiting to what they would call reposition, which means demolish and redevelop the properties. So to do that, because redevelopment in DC and anywhere, but almost very especially in DC, is political. It's inherently political. So if you want to redevelop, you want to grease the wheels and make sure your project goes through in a timely fashion, you partner with somebody that's politically connected, and that's what they did. They partnered with a guy named Jeff Griffiths, who ran a company called City Partners LLC, and they formed a joint organization called Sanford/City Partners LLC, and that joint venture was the company that had put forward a proposal to the zoning commission to redevelop these properties. So by the time I got to the tenants, they had been approached to try to leave the property. When you talk to the tenants, there was some intimidation, harassment that was going on, trying to get them to leave. And the reason that they want people to leave is because in DC, tenants have these things called TOPA rights. TOPA is the Tenant Opportunity to Purchase Act. I don't know if you guys have discussed it before in your program. You probably have, but it's powerful if it's used properly, because it gives tenants the opportunity to either, one, purchase their property themselves when it's either up for sale or on the chopping block for demolition. So if a developer wants to demolish your place, you got the right to team up with your neighbors and buy it if you can. If you can't do that, then you can find another developer who's willing to pay either the purchase price if the property is being sold, or pay fair market value for the property if it's up for demolition. And you can partner with that developer to do something with the building that actually benefits you as a tenant. So TOPA sort of allows tenants to really be engaged in the development process in a way in which they wouldn't be able to otherwise. And, you know, predictably, developers hate TOPA. Why? Because it gives tenants to be able to have a say in what happens to their communities. So there is a fine art in Washington, D.C. of developers doing dirty tricks to try to get people screwed out of their buildings before they can exercise their TOPA rights. Constructive eviction, not making repairs, is one of those tricks. So if you make a place so terrible to live in that tenants are like, why am I paying rent here? You know, why should I can go find some other place? Why am I going to pay rent here? Then, you know, they'll just leave before you got to give the tenants their legal right. You exercise TOPA, the landlord has to give you a notice saying, I'm going to demolish this property or I'm going to sell this property. So if you can get them out before you got to give that notice, then you've just solved a huge headache for yourself as a developer. A lot of lawyers, I'll say real quick, and I think it's important for people to understand this, especially tenants who might be watching this. Beware of lawyers in DC that come to you and try to get you to give up your TOPA rights real quick to a developer, because there is a real practice of law in DC where lawyers go around saying that they're representing tenant associations, and they'll get the tenants to form a tenant coalition, to form a tenant association, and to sign away their TOPA rights for nothing, for like hardly any money. And, you know, tenants are just kind of cast to the wind. They'll sign away their rights and they'll say, okay, you know, the developer will say, I'm going to give you $2,000 to leave, and I'll give you 60 days to find a new place.
Are these attorneys working with the developer?
A lot of times, I believe, yes, they are, because a lot of those attorneys will write themselves in the development agreement. Like they get 10 grand from the developer to represent the tenants. So the developer is basically paying a lawyer to herd cats for them, form the association, and get people out of the building.
Wow.
So be very aware, tenants. If your building's going up for sale and you get some lawyer knocking on your door saying he wants to represent you and take you through the TOPA process, do your research on what lawyers are out there doing this work. Because I think that, again, you can imagine being a lawyer, you can represent 10 buildings at once and write yourself 10 grand into these development agreements and make a lot of money in a very short period of time representing these tenant associations when you're essentially working for the developer. It's highly unethical. Lawyers should be reported, you know, if they're doing that, but I think that that happens a lot in DC. It's, again, one of these tricks that developers use to get people out of buildings without truly being able to exercise your TOPA rights. However, if you have a lawyer who's informing you and showing you how you can leverage these TOPA rights properly, they're extremely valuable, and they can put you in the driver's seat to have a really good experience in a redevelopment process. A really good experience might be putting it a little bit too, you know, might be too optimistic, because it is a very highly stressful, you know, situation for tenants to be in. And as the Congress Heights story shows, it took that tenant coalition almost a decade to be able to exercise those rights.
Tell us what happened with Congress Heights.
Sure. So I'm sorry, I'm being a little long-winded here on the buildup, but with Congress Heights, I came down to the tenant association, met with them. There was the buildings were in terrible shape. So there was a rodent infestation. There were every time it rained, the basements would flood. There was a stench associated with that, you know, in the basements that went up all through the common areas and into the apartments. There was the grass wasn't being cut at the property. The property was being unsecured. There was no security lights on the outside of the property. The front door locks didn't work on the property. And in the back of the property, in the parking lots, there was obviously, people knew that they could dump trash there. So there was just trash strewn all over the back of the property. So the high grass, the trash all over the back of the property led to the rodent infestation. The flooding of the basement made it extremely unpleasant to live in there because of the stench. And what Sanford was doing, as people were moving out of the property due to those conditions, they weren't backfilling the property. So not only weren't backfilling the property, meaning they weren't moving new tenants into the units the tenants vacated, they weren't securing the vacant units. So you have people coming in off the streets, shooting up, you know, doing drugs, falling asleep with candles lit in the vacant units. And my assumption was that this was intentional. Like, obviously they weren't going to bring people into a building where they wanted people out of the building. So by not filling those vacant units, by leaving the front door open, by not cutting the grass, I believed that they were creating an attractive nuisance for people to come in. And again, it was making life absolutely miserable for the tenants living in there. So that was what I walked into at the Congress Heights properties. Very shortly after I started representing them, the developer reached out and they wanted a meeting with the tenants. And this was one of the craziest things I've ever seen. So
Now, what did you do to make them want to meet with the tenants?
I didn't do anything. I think that they knew that the tenants had a lawyer now, so that they were going to have to try to negotiate. And to negotiate, their first thought was, let's go down, do a face-to-face with the tenants and see if we can, get them out quickly. So they came down and it had just rained really hard. So the basement in one of the buildings had been flooded and it had just receded, but the stench was bad. So the tenants said, let's have them meet down in the basement. They just flooded. So, I walk in and I'm fairly new to DC. I'm from like rural Ohio. I'm this white guy from rural Ohio, new to DC. And I'm like, I don't know what's going on here. So before I can say anything, the door opens and there's the two developers standing there. And the tenants were like, hey, yeah, come on down, come downstairs. And we can talk about TOPA rights. So one of these developers had a bag of cookies. Like he had stopped and bought some Chips Ahoy cookies. And I thought to myself, is this guy really gonna try, after what they put these people through, he's gonna try to give them cookies and act like everything's cool and they should trust him and sign away their TOPA rights to him. So the tenants, they came down with their bag of cookies and they said, hey, we want two things. We want you to sign your TOPA rights to us. In exchange for assigning your TOPA rights to us, we'll move you to other places that we own. And you can come back, once the redevelopment's built. We'll let you back into the redeveloped properties. And we also need you to show up to the zoning commission and say that we're great people and that the zoning commission should approve our project. And the tenants predictably were like, you gotta be crazy, for us to think that we can trust you to bring us back to this community once it's rebuilt, after you've been trying to drive us out of this building for the last however many months. You really think that, we believe that you're going to try to bring us back? And this is, again, something, if you're around DC and you're from DC, you've seen this a million times. Some developer is going to knock down your building. He promises to bring you back to the relocated properties, and it very rarely happens. This is a trick that developers use, these promises, and a lot of times they don't deliver on them. So the tenant said, I'll tell you what, we refuse to deal with you at all until you make immediate repairs to our property. If you make some immediate repairs to our property, then we can start talking. So that was something that was extremely intelligent for the tenants to do right off the bat, to make him show good faith, to make repairs before they would talk to him. Predictably, those repairs did not get made. Instead, things started getting worse for the tenants at the property. So when it was clear to the developer that the tenants were not going to be manipulated, the gloves really came off. And the conditions at the property started to get, really, really bad. We, as a tenant association, made the decision to bring DCRA out to, inspect the properties, try to get.
Now, what's DCRA?
DCRA is an organization, it's an agency in DC that's tasked with inspecting properties. And if there's conditions issues with properties, fining, putting the owner of the properties on notice and fining the owner if repairs aren't made. Now, the issue with that, this is where the political comes into the development side of this stuff. DCRA was highly, they were just terrible. They couldn't be depended on. So DCRA, they wouldn't consider the common areas of the property. They would say, well, we are only looking at what's inside the tenant's units. We're not going to, inspect the common areas of the property. And, inside the tenant's units, there were some infestations in there with rodents because there were rodents everywhere. But the tenants, Like you walked into their building, into their units, and tenants kept their places nice. You know what I'm saying? Like these people had dignity, they had pride, they had nice places to live in. So even though they were living in like these horrible conditions on the outside of the building and the common areas of the building, the inspector would walk in and say, well, this is that, this is that. Sometimes like the heat would go out in the building. So the inspector, would note that there's no heat in the building. The repairs that were made were the reports that were made by DCRA. They wouldn't share with the tenants. They would only share with the developer. So it became a real issue. I was recruiting law students at clinics because I was the only lawyer working out there with the tenants. I was recruiting law clinic students to take these cases into conditions court in DC and to get immediate repairs made. There is a court in DC that like you can file a complaint and get in front of a judge. It's supposed to be in a week or two. It's used to try to get immediate repairs made. So what was happening was DCRA was making these reports that were actually making it more difficult. Once we went into conditions court to try to explain what was going on to a judge, he'd look at the DCRA report and say, it doesn't seem that bad, So we were taking pictures, we were doing everything we could. And the big thing we did was we went to zoning and we challenged the redevelopment process to the zoning commission on the grounds that these places were in terrible condition. And this is not a developer that Washington, D.C. should be doing business with and allowing this redevelopment to take place because he wasn't trustworthy. So we started going on record. We started sharing because we couldn't depend on the agencies that were tasked with doing the correct thing. What we as a tenant started doing, we partnered with community organizations and we went to the media. And this was really sort of organizing, it was lawyering in a way that was a little unconventional. It was partnering with community organizations. And it was really, for a while, I became an investigative journalist and started putting the pieces together of who was behind this redevelopment project, how they were connected back to politicians in Washington, D.C., and what this redevelopment, was about, which was, pushing out these tenants and getting a lot of people paid a lot of money. And a lot of those people had connections directly back to politicos in Washington, D.C. That was a story that was pretty compelling. And the Washington Post actually picked up on it and wrote a front page story above the fold on what was happening in the neighborhood and how the tenants were being affected by this and how the people who were executing this plan were connected directly to, politicians in Washington, D.C. And when that happened, a lot of things changed. And the big thing that changed is the power dynamics of the case shifted. So it went from, myself and the Washington Legal Clinic and community organizations like One DC. We were working with a guy, Eugene Puryear, who was an organizer. And Caroline Hennessy was a great organizer out there. But we started shining the light on these things. We raised the profile of the case, and that got the Attorney General involved of DC. So we went from that's the second article that talks about how long the tenants have been waiting for TOPA. And it says why a law to protect against gentrification doesn't really work. And the point of the article was that most people are pushed out. That is when I told you that the vacants weren't secured. So that's a unit that somebody had been living in. They moved out. And when they moved out, it wasn't secured. And just a bunch of people busted in, and look at what they did to that unit. And that's what tenants were living with, were people who were busted into the units and doing that sort of thing to the units. So when we raised the profile, we sort of flipped the power dynamics of what was going on. Now it wasn't these politically connected developers against community organizers and, a nonprofit attorney. We got, you know, a section of real government power on our side. And they were able to file because there was such hubris on the part of the developers. They weren't, you know, they wouldn't make repairs. The government agencies wouldn't hold them accountable to make repairs. They were so over the top in trying to get people pushed out because they thought that they had all the political power on their side, that they really walked themselves into a receivership. And a receivership is when the tenant association asks a judge to appoint a third party to take control of the property, to spend the necessary money, to make the necessary repairs, to bring the property up to code. And the money they spend is the guy who owns the building. So that is terrifying for, you know, someone like Sanford Capital, for this, you know, person, the slumlord, to think that a judge has the ability to have a third party come in, do their own inspection of everything, and then say, Judge, I need however many $1 million to bring this up to code. And that slumlord who's trying to get people out of his building, who's trying to demolish these buildings, now has to come into his pocket and pay that money to fix those buildings.
So is that how it ended?
Yeah, well, that's not how it ended. That was because these people had some sticking power. This slumlord had some sticking power, and his political connected partner had sticking power because they still knew this thing was a gold mine. So they did not want to give it up. So what they did, Sanford at that point had been pilloried in the press because, you know, this story about this property exposed that they owned a bunch of other properties. You know, once reporters started digging, they saw that they owned a bunch of properties and that they were all in horrible condition. Now, let me take a step back and go back to the offer originally that they gave to the tenants, was that we'll relocate you to one of our other properties. Can you imagine if the tenants would have took that offer and just had to go live in another one of their properties that they weren't making repairs in? They would probably try to kick the tenants out of before this property was ever built. So the tenants were had a lot of foresight. They were very, very smart about how they assessed the situation and, you know, how they conducted their business. So the wisdom of the people that were involved in this was you know, was one of the things that really put this, you know, allowed them to get this victory. So the receivership's in place. So Sanford now has been pilloried in the press. It turned out that they were getting a ton of government subsidies. The government was actually exiting homeless families from the homeless shelters into Sanford properties and paying Sanford for those people, those vulnerable people, to live in these properties. And they did this because DC has no affordable housing. And people are exited from shelters in DC on a time-limited subsidy that ends. The program at that point was supposed to end in a year. So no reputable landlord would take these people into their properties because market rate in DC for 2 bedrooms like $3,200 a month. So you're taking someone who's maybe working a minimum wage job in DC and you're giving them a subsidy that ends after a year. And you're telling them, go out and find a landlord to take you. Well, what landlord are they going to find? They're going to find a slumlord. And that slumlord, so they were exiting people. They created a subprime market for low-income individuals to be in these Sanford Capital properties. That got exposed because these tenants stood up and fought, wouldn't be pushed out. So that was exposed to the media. So Sanford was being pilloried. Sanford wanted out of this.
Now
When the property got put in the receivership, they cried uncle. They wanted out. So what they concocted with the city partners person was, because he still wanted in it. So they did an illegal transfer of the property from Sanford Capital to city partners while the property was in receivership. And they have been ordered by the judge to deal with us, the Tenants Association, to see if they could work out a sale of the property to us. They had 60 days to work out that sale. So we were negotiating in good faith with Sanford, trying to negotiate the sale of the property to the Tenants Association via a nonprofit developer that we had identified. And the whole time they were concocting a scheme to illegally transfer the properties without giving us our TOPA rights. So they dressed up the sale of the property to what they argued was a deed in lieu of foreclosure, which is a transfer that's exempt from TOPA. It wasn't a deed in lieu of foreclosure, it was a sale. And that allowed us, the Tenants Association, we filed an affirmative lawsuit against them saying that the property was transferred illegally, which allowed us to put a lis pendens on the property. So we clouded the title to their property so that they couldn't transfer the property anymore. So now the new guy, the old guy the guy from City Partners, this is Jeff Griffiths, who formed the partnership with Sanford at the very beginning. Sanford wanted out. Griffiths said, I don't want out. I'm going to still try to win this. Transfer me these properties. We will dress it up to avoid TOPA. We'll disguise the sale in order to avoid TOPA, and I'll handle this. So that's what they did. That gave us the ability to file the lawsuit. It clouded their title. So now they were dealing with, it was just Jeff Griffiths who had the property and City Partners, his company, and they were dealing with the receivership. And now they had an affirmative lawsuit against us. They had an affirmative lawsuit filed by us against them. So amazingly, Mr. Griffiths went in front of the judge in the receivership and tried to act as if he had never been a part of this project and that he was riding in on his white horse and that he was going to do right by the tenants and solve it all. It was almost, like an alternative reality that, he tried to get everyone to believe that, was happening. This is the guy back in 2015. This was in 2017, 2018, he was doing this. This was the same guy that back in 2015 had formed a company called Sanford Partners / Sanford Capital / City Partner LLC, and was the face of the project through the zoning process. And now he was coming from the judge saying, this is me, I'm new, I am not Sanford Capital, I'm going to do right by these people, we're going to get everything worked out. So judge, go ahead and dismiss the receivership. You can trust me.
Wow.
So the judge, to his credit, said, no, I don't think so. You've been involved in this project from the very beginning, and welcome to the receivership, Mr. Griffiths. Mr. Receiver, how much money do we need by next week to fix these places up? So that was, how this
is this part
started going down. Yeah. So this was as a result of those Congress Heights tenants standing up. They were able to leverage this $1 million settlement from Sanford Capital to give money to all the tenants that had been living in their properties to repay them for rent that they had paid to Sanford while they were living in these deplorable conditions.
Yeah, they call them inhumane living conditions. Now I'm going to bring Dr. Cheney in to ask some questions. Dr. Cheney, you there? Your mic is.
Yes, I'm here. Welcome, Attorney Merrifield.
Thank you.
I mean, what you've shared with us is really interesting because a lot of us tenants have gone through this.
Yeah.
And I was definitely involved in a TOPA. I was the tenant president here at Capitol Park, dealing with TOPA. And it is definitely life-changing.
Yeah.
And I tip my hat off to you because you stayed with the tenants. Our attorney that we really had a lot of faith in was eventually bought out with a $200,000 deal.
Yeah.
And that's a lot of cash. and he walked away from us. We were devastated.
Mm.
So I just commend you that you stayed with the tenants.
Thank you.
You pretty much answered my first question because I wanted to know the strategies that were utilized by your clients, the Tenants Association, to get their housing code violations publicly noticed. So if you said that, and then I wanted to know about the intervention of the DC Attorney General, because as far as I know, that is not a routine issue.
No.
or
No,
act.
it was unprecedented. It was the first receivership that the Attorney General had taken part of in DC. So it was a big deal. And I will say, working with the Attorney General's office, I got to give them some shine because they did a great job. I mean, they were very professional, and they always stuck with the tenants as well and made sure that they were taking their lead from the tenants. I think as an attorney for young people, kids in law school that, young adults in law school that might be watching this, one of the things that I've learned through this process is follow the lead of your tenants, because the tenants will, a lot of times for me during this process, the tenants, they wanted to fight. And if your tenants want to fight, you listen to your tenants. And I think a lot of attorneys have the notion to settle, especially when you're dealing with things like the dispossession of people from their homes. It's easy to settle. But if you take the lead of your clients and you engage your clients in the process and have a collaborative relationship with your clients where you're discussing strategy with one another, one, you learn a lot from them. And then two, they can learn some of the legal strategy behind things, and they can inform you with their life experiences, what's going on, combined with the legal stuff. And it makes your legal strategy so much better when it's informed by really the thoughts and the ideas of the tenants. So both the Attorney General's office, and I think, myself, and I had attorneys from Arnold and Porter that came in and were working with me on this case. Not attorneys, it was really one guy, Blake Biles, who was amazing. And I think that we all took our lead from the tenants, especially the tenant president, Ruth Barnwell, who was, savvy.
Yeah.
She knew what was going on, and she really helped us inform a legal strategy that helped us win.
Okay, I just have two quick ones. The DC Tenants Bill of Rights, we all know about that. Hopefully some of the tenants have a clue about that. That document allows, I'm curious about that document and allowing your clients or your tenants to organize. Did anyone in the group, your tenants, get threatened with eviction, which I have, and other forms of retaliation, which I have, and what did you do?
Yeah, I mean, for sure that people were intimidated through the process. People were threatened through the process. What we did was exposed all of that through the media. We shined a light on it through the media. The DC law allows you to file a lawsuit against anyone who does that, against a landlord who does that. It's interfering with your right to organize. I know the Washington Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights in DC does a lot of work where they file those cases on behalf of tenants. So, absolutely, tenants have a legal right to, I think it's $10,000 per violation if you can prove the violation of the interference of your right to organize. I will say with our tenant association, we were very focused on, going on the record at places like public places like the Zoning Commission, ANC meetings, and obviously through the media. And we kept ourselves out of litigation. This was the strategy that we took. We kept ourselves out of litigation with every little thing we could have filed until we build up to that big thing, which was the receivership. Because what happens is if you're involved in a bunch of smaller types of litigation, it takes up a lot of time. It takes up a lot of energy. And we were organizing marches, in front of the developer's house. We were going up to Cleveland Park, and we brought, the whole community up there and said, well, you think you can do this east of the river and you can come and live in Cleveland Park and your neighbors aren't going to know about it? So we took the tact of doing those sorts of things as opposed to filing every little bit of, lawsuits that we could have. We were focused on getting something that would break their back, and that's what the TOPA lawsuit ended up doing and the receivership ended up doing. It really broke their back instead of trying to cut them with a bunch of paper cuts.
Okay. And the last thing is, I'm curious about, and I'm sure others are too, what is the message being sent to slum landlords? So what is being sent to slum housing providers by this case? And I look at a situation where some landlords will fix up some of the apartments, and they basically do that for the new tenants. And then the older tenants, and I'm not talking about age, I'm talking about longevity in the apartment building, their units are not fixed up and they're living in the same environment. Is that a form of discrimination?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, absolutely it is. You're treating, one class of people different than another class of people. Now, the thing with, so Congress Heights, I think, the message it sends is, puts people on notice, and that's good. There are hundreds of cases like Congress Heights happening all over DC. Anybody that lives in DC understands that. And, it's hard. The Congress Heights, I think the lesson people can take from Congress Heights is that if you're a tenant, stand up and fight. Don't be shy. Don't be worried about retaliation. I know that's easy for me to say. It's hard when you're in the situation. But if you stand and fight, if you shine light on what's going on, you got a fighting chance of winning. But systemically, from a policy perspective, Washington, D.C. has to do better. And, in the enforcement of, like I talked about earlier with DCRA, wasn't doing their jobs, wasn't enforcing housing code violations, was being myopic, was not taking a broad approach to looking at the entire building when they inspected. Things like that have to improve. The government intervention of the government intervention of the Attorney General's office was big, but we're not going to have the same Attorney General. There's going to be a new Attorney General moving forward. So will that office continue to seek out and prosecute slumlords? Because that's what needs to happen. Those are all things that we as a community got to put pressure on our elected leaders to do, because there's a lot of things elected leaders can do, like the Attorney General did in this case, to materially affect people's lives in a positive way. And what we see too often in DC is politicians doing the opposite. They're materially benefiting developers and people who are trying to displace existing tenants at the expense of people that have lived in this community for a very long time, as investment is then rolling into the communities. I mean, what you see is communities that are completely underserved, and then an avalanche of capital coming into these communities, pushing out the people that have lived there, bringing in a whole new group of people, wealthier, whiter people that are then living in these communities. So you have this concept of disinvestment, communities, mostly Black, east of the river communities, flood of money, a brief period of integration in these communities because whiter people move into the communities once the money comes, an elevation in rents and an elevation in land values, and then the resegregation of the communities as the long-term African-American residents are pushed out further and further. And that is such a failed model and such a failed approach. It makes developers very wealthy. And, you know, you can look at bright new shiny buildings, but the disinvestment in people is criminal. And I mean, you see it, it's going to come back to haunt you, you know, as a community, when you disinvest, when you treat people like that. So I think systemically on a policy issue, that's what needs to be addressed, first and foremost, in the way the city looks at development. And they have to move away from this manifest destiny type of development into an inclusive type of development that invests in people as much as it invests in buildings. There's a $17.5 billion budget in the city. It could be a utopia for people because it's not very big. And instead, it's just horrid inequality.
I think that's a good.
Thank you.
I think that's a good segue to bring John in. John, you unmute. I think you're still muted.
Okay,
There we go.
what a story. Wow, Will, my hat's off to you. Goodness knows, that's it's great to hear the law and an attorney really taking such a stand. That's certainly something we don't hear enough of, and particularly in these kind of circumstances. So again, plaudits to you, plaudits to the community, as you're saying. The Tenants Association, the tenants are a real source of wisdom. So nice to see that somebody picks that up. Because yeah, too often those folks get steamrolled, or again, well, you know, doing all this stuff takes all this time and I got to file all these things and I want to get this through as quickly as possible. And that often is a moment where an attorney and the attorney's client, in a sense, don't have the same objectives, or they're not quite aligned because, yeah, they're not necessarily paying you and blah, blah, blah. And so, again, plaudits to that. Maybe I missed something along the way here. Where does this stand today?
So thank you. I realized we didn't get, so what happened was finally, we were able to force a sale of the property. So through the receivership and through our litigation, we got city partners to agree to sell to the nonprofit developer that we had lined up 8 years ago. And on that site now is going to be 179 units of affordable housing. It's going to be affordable. 75% of the units are going to be affordable to people making between $26,000 and $45,000 a year. So it was a fight to get housing there above that metro that's still going to serve working class people that live in that existing community as opposed to new people. And there's also going to be, as part of the redevelopment process, originally there was going to be an office building and a luxury apartment building. There still will be an office building above that metro, but the housing will be affordable. So hopefully it'll be an influx of jobs and some money from the, hopefully people in the community can get jobs that the office building will bring, and, still have affordable housing over top that metro.
Awesome.
All right, that's great news. And I want to point out here for people listening, when we talk about injustices, that what Will has just described strikes me, and again, correct me, Will, because you're more deeply in this than I am these days, but rare. That is the District of Columbia, oh, we're going to build affordable housing. Oh, we're going to build affordable housing. And then they define affordable housing at 3 to 5 times the level of income that you just mentioned. Yep. Oh, it's 80% of AMI. Well, in DC, 80% of AMI ends up being $80-some odd thousand a year is considered affordable housing. Yeah. So you're now building something that the people you just talked about ain't never going to get near, right? What is that, like 30% of AMI or something along those lines? Yeah. Area median income, again, for those of us who haven't heard that. So that's a huge victory on the justice side.
Yeah. No, it's big. Yeah. To your point, the thing it's just like mind blowing in DC, it's very Orwellian, is that the city will give, millions, tens, at Brooklyn Manor, they're giving the developer, I've represented tenants at Brooklyn Manor, they're giving the developer $47 million to demolish an entirely affordable housing project. So 22 acres of affordable housing, and the government gave $47 million, which is half of what they usually put in the Housing Production Trust Fund for the whole year, for their whole affordable housing, pot of money they gave to demolish affordable housing. So that's why we're in the situation we're in. But, the way they play tricks on people's minds is that the government will give money, public money to a developer, say $50 million, to build what they call a mixed use, property. And they'll say it's affordable because it meets the inclusory zoning requirements. Well, the inclusory zoning requirements are a joke. It's like 8% of the ground floor, or 8% of like the square footage has to be affordable. So you're getting a couple of affordable units at like 80% of the area median income. And the government is justifying a public money or public land giveaway to that developer because they're saying, well, they're building affordable housing. So you're getting like a couple of, studio apartments for, young professionals moving into DC with their first job. And they're saying that is, affordable housing. So the defining of these things, to your point, I think is very important, defining what is and what is not affordable and holding the government, to account to say that's not really affordable. You're giving away our public money to this developer who happens to contribute a lot of money to you, and they're not building affordable housing.
So there's that injustice that you've made a big difference on. The trickier one is not even the Sanford Capital people, because the concept of the rapacious developer, that's in the woodwork. If somebody can figure out a way to make money, they're going to make money. Okay, fine. That's capitalism, blah, blah. The counterbalance for that is that we now have the government, I guess for want of a word, the government is now supposed to make sure that, okay, be a capitalist, but don't destroy people's lives in the process, don't abuse people in the process, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And clearly Congress Heights is a single, obviously Dr. Cheney can tell us another, shall we say, great story of where the government ain't doing its job. Or indeed, worse than that, as I hear you talking, and I think I read the article that you sent us about Congress Heights, and that you may have been at these public hearings. I think you're quoted in the article at the public hearings. And I wonder if you sat there listening to the council members, Anita Bonds, et cetera, and in the back of your mind, you're hearing this quote from Casablanca. I'm shocked that there's gambling going on here as they hand you your winnings. I mean, is there really any credibility there sitting on the dais of the DC Council?
Yeah, I mean, the council members, I don't think are invested. I can't point to council members that are actually invested in actually creating opportunities for people who are thinking outside the box and how to create affordable housing. I actually ran for office last year on a platform of social housing because, you talked about the rapacious developer, and I am one who can be accused of banging on developers. But when you really look into the way housing is financed in this country and across the world at this point, it is, sovereign wealth funds, institutional investors, hedge funds, investment banks, and they are, there is a flood of money coming into coastal cities like DC, New York, San Francisco, and they're only investing in luxury apartments. And the way these projects are financed, people get paid out at different times. So the project can fail, but people can still make, a good profit. So it dictates housing being built in communities that has no rational relationship between what the community needs and what is actually being built. And that's why you see a bunch of luxury, apartments in DC that aren't really filled up. And it's very puzzling to people. You see in the Southwest waterfront, there's been more development there than any other place in DC, yet rents have spiked instead of gone down, which, the example developers and politicians love to give is if we build, then rents will come down due to basic supply and demand. But we see that it doesn't work like that. I would argue that it doesn't work like that because of the way these projects are financed. And I think government has to look at housing as infrastructure. And I think that we can look to a lot of international models that would show that if you build housing, the government can create housing, can build housing, and can build housing with a mix of incomes where the rents that people are paying for those units is being paid to cover the operating costs of the building, much like a co-op operates. And if you do that correctly and you have the correct mix of incomes in that property, if everybody's paying 20 to 30% of their income, and you have higher income earners, lower income earners, and no developer associated with it, then the money beyond what's being used to cover the operating costs, what would be that profit for the developer, can actually go to pay off the construction loans for the building. So you can create mixed income, deeply affordable housing that actually pays for itself. And there's countries that do this. And that to me is a way to invest in communities, have capital injection into communities that need it, while building housing for people living in those communities. It can allow people not to live in perpetual debt while they're in this housing, because people don't have to be rent poor. They can save up and they can buy a house, which is just completely unattainable for a lot of people right now because they're constantly paying so much in rent. And further, the ground floor retail at these buildings, drives small businesses out. When you build a luxury apartment building, the ground floor retail is going to be something, it's going to be usually a chain, because the rents are so expensive at the ground floor retail that local businesses can't stay in business. Again, we see this in Southwest waterfront where the fish market was pushed out. It's iconic. The fish market was iconic in DC, pushed out. So people, small businesses could be paying rent at the ground floor retail of a social housing building. That rent could go a long way and to cover the operating costs of the building, paying down the construction loans, but it would be inclusive. It would be, to allow small businesses to continue to be in DC, to thrive in DC, to give people an opportunity to live in affordable housing. And it could be a jobs program for people and a way to green our housing infrastructure. So I think if council members wanted to get underneath this issue and actually solve the affordable housing crisis, they have to move away from the idea that hedge funds are going to save us, and that if we just allow hedge funds to invest a bunch of money with developers to build luxury apartments, at some point in the future, it's going to trickle down, because it just won't. That's not what reality shows. So I think we got to think outside the box if we want to solve this problem.
Mr. Merrifield, Merrifield, thank you so much for coming on. Thank you so what you're doing in DC, representing these tenants and these associations and fighting for justice. We need more attorneys like you.
Well, thank you for having me. I really appreciate the opportunity to be on and to tell the story of Congress Heights. And everyone getting ready for the bar exam, good luck. You'll do fine.
Yes, thank you. And Dr. Cheney, Mr. Salati, thank you as always.
Always a pleasure.
Bye-bye.
Take care.
Good luck, Will.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Thanks for watching our video. For experienced legal services in Washington, D.C., Alabama, and Washington State, visit our website at remuslaw.com or call us at 1-833-329-1799.
Wait a little bit longer. wait a little, we'll be coming around again. Cause you know we're stronger than we were when you and I began. I don't know what's harder, holding on or letting go. I don't know if we oughta, know if we oughta, know I don't. I don't know where we're going, but I know it's gonna be good. I don't know where we're going, but I know it's gonna be good.
The lessons taught in the adventures of Uncle Billy and Ross are lesson that adults learn late in life. Some never learn it. I will recommend every parent, every young person, every adult read this book. But more importantly, apply the lessons.